I'm George Hoberg. Good afternoon. I'm a professor here in the Lew Institute for Global Issues, and I want to begin. I love being in this room, and it's always a nice way to start things to acknowledge that we're fortunate to be here on the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So I wanted to do that first. Since the U.S. election on November 8th, by my count, the Earth has rotated around its axis 17 times, just as it had the previous 17 days. But somehow, everything seems fundamentally different. The Trump election has been like just an immensely powerful earthquake. I think we all have our own individual thing. I grew up in the States. I'm not Canadian, but I'm still an American dual national citizen, and has profound consequences, not just for the way we think about and understand American politics and culture, but I don't know, for me and maybe for others, it challenges what we think we know, and also kind of this period or moment that we have in history right now. So it is really a very big development, and we wanted to bring people together here to begin thinking through what this implies moving forward. This forum is not going to be about how Trump happened. It's going to be about what we're likely to, some scenarios for what we're likely to experience as the Trump administration takes over power in January. We have very lucky to have with us four very distinguished experts on the issue. I'll give a brief introduction to the four of them first, and then invite them up individually for a 10-minute talk, and that should leave lots of time for questions and discussions among the panel afterwards. Paul Quirk will be our first speaker. Is the Phil Lynn Chair in U.S. Politics and Representation in the Department of Political Science, and he's also the coordinator of the U.S. Studies program. He's taught at several American universities before coming here to UBC in 2004. He's an expert in congressional presidency relations, public opinion, and public policy, and he's going to be talking to us today about the transition that we're seeing between Trump as campaigner and Trump as in terms of governance as we move forward. Our second speaker will be Dr. Richard Price. He's a professor in UBC's political science department as well, and a specialist in international relations. Lots of interesting stuff for Richard. His research interests focus on the role of norms in world politics, particularly norms limiting warfare, the politics of international law, and ethics in world politics. And he's the co-author most recently of Special Responsibilities, Global Problems, and American Power. And Dr. Price will talk to us today about Trump's possible implications for America's role in the world. Werner Antweiler is an associate professor in the Sauder School of Business, where he has many hats. He's chair of international trade policy. He's chair of the Strategy and Business Economics Division and director of the Sauder School of Business Prediction Markets, which I believe, like everyone else, was very far off in predicting a Clinton victory. He's published widely on environmental regulation and international trade, and he'll discuss the implications of a Trump presidency for trade and trade agreements with Canada. Dr. Kathryn Harrison is professor of political science at UBC and currently the acting Dean of Arts. She's a specialist on comparative public policy and the effectiveness of alternative policy instruments, particularly applied to environmental policy. She's a leading expert on federalism and environmental policy and carbon pricing as a way to address climate change, and she'll discuss what the Trump election might mean for energy and climate policies in the US and their potential spillover into Canada. So that's the order that we're going to go in, and so I'll invite Dr. Quirk to come up and give us his 10 minutes on the transition from campaigning to governing.
Thank you, George. So I've been wrong about every significant political judgment that I've made over the last 18 months. So listen up. Nobody else really did a lot better on the matters that I'm talking about, though, so I don't feel distinctively discredited. I'm going to talk about several things and just try to make some points that I think are not obvious about each of them. One is, so we have a new president, Donald Trump, and one question that has been debated a good deal is what are his qualifications for leadership? What are we likely to see in terms of strengths and weaknesses of him as a political leader? Clearly, he has some outstanding capabilities. I think the most important one is that he clearly can communicate effectively with ordinary people. Some of this has to do with the style of vocabulary and sentence structure that he uses and his use of repetition. He also is clearly a risk taker, someone who thinks big and takes chances. I think it's important, this is a theme of media coverage and also I think of academic coverage, to avoid kind of false equivalence and normalizing a candidate who in many ways is really not a normal candidate. So I want to say that based on what scholars and commentators and close observers of the presidency have thought were crucial requirements for a successful presidency, Donald Trump falls severely short in many ways. That is, they're entirely apart from partisan leanings, from the way we used to think about this subject, he seems to be quite deficient. The big categories, I think, are experience, lack of any government experience at all, his cognitive style, namely recklessness and superficiality, and what the political scientist Fred Greenstein, who writes about presidential character and leadership abilities, emotional intelligence. That is his tendency to personalize conflict and possibly narcissistic tendencies. I want to point out that I think some of the things that he was criticized about most severely are actually less important than those. Those are things that can readily affect decision-making and leadership. You know, so his supposed or alleged racism, misogyny, and financial corruption, I would argue those are things that you can debate about and people paid a lot of attention to them, but they're not that likely to affect what happens in the presidency. There's a Woody Allen joke about, from a movie about Richard Nixon saying that, you know, they would count the silverware when he left the White House because he was a crook. Well, that's not really the kind of thing you have to worry about with presidents. So, and an interesting question is whether these attributes of his, which may have some reality to them, whether they affect policy or not. He's actually been doing pretty well at appointing women so far. And he claims to have plans to reform lobbying in ways that would reduce the influence of people with money. I think that these tendencies of his about racism and his treatment of women in the past, you know, the allegations which are quite well supported about sexual assault, I think these are important culturally and symbolically. That is, I think there's a real loss when people cannot point to the president as someone who they admire personally. But I don't think it's actually that these things are going to enter into government in any very large way. So these traits that I referred to led to an extraordinarily broad and consensual rejection of his leadership, of his qualifications on the part of the political system in general, including most Republicans, except for Republicans in Congress, you know, who had to worry about their reelection. So I think there's plenty to be worried about regarding his leadership abilities. Now, this literature that I referred to briefly about leadership capabilities points out that you can't predict very much or very confidently from the abilities and character traits of presidents. Some of the presidents who have had serious weaknesses have worked out arguably pretty well. People argue that Abraham Lincoln was subject to depression, not a good trait to have. Okay, now I'm going to comment just very briefly on what we learn about the election. So this was a big surprise. I'm not going to take a lot of time for that. I don't think what's interesting about this is that the polls were wrong. I think what's interesting is that if you think about what people thought in Trump's chances were in May or June, and then if you were to ask them, well, what would happen if if he ran a convention that was extremely negative and disliked by most of the public, and then he attacked a respectable Muslim family, and then he attacked a former Miss Universe, and then he was revealed to have committed sexual assault and bragged about it. You know, if you said what would happen with all that, people would say, well, he's going to lose by a lot, right? All of these were things that we would have thought would have big negative effects. The fact that the polls are off by a couple of points at the end is, to me, a small thing. What I think we learned from these things is that partisanship in the electorate is much bigger and less critical, less intelligent, less informed than we thought. That is, people have less capability to take some distance from their political parties and to evaluate information. I also think that we need to look at something about what is it that was motivating these people who supported Trump. And I think we're encountering some evidence that a lot of it had to do with a sort of a type of identity politics, on the right, connected especially with white people and maybe with lower educated people and lower income people. Now, what's interesting about that is that Donald Trump did not have a policy agenda that was particularly compelling or convincing or that stood up to criticism from their standpoint. So what I think is important, this is, I think, learning something new about the American voter, is that people were motivated by the fact that he seemed to respect and care about their kind of people and be willing to act like them and speak like them. So I think it's a kind of an identification at a more more basic emotional level than what we had seen before. About the way the government is going to work, I think Donald Trump is likely to have more power in Washington, more ability to affect policy change than any president has had since Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. A comparison might be Lyndon Johnson, who had much larger majorities in Congress, but at that time the parties were far more diverse internally, and there were many more moderates in Congress and much more need to build coalitions across boundaries. I think there will be very little in the way of what of whatever it is that the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress can agree on. There will be very little to stand in the way of. There's one issue to watch with respect to that, and that is whether the filibuster will continue to exist. So in the Senate, there are enough Democrats to filibuster successfully under current practices. But the Senate has been talking about abolishing or severely curtailing the filibuster for quite a long time, both under Democrats and under Republicans, and for very good reasons. The filibuster has been abused. Senator McConnell, the Republican leader, has been saying that he does not want to eliminate the filibuster. Republicans realize that they're going to be in the minority again at some point. However, I think that the pressures on Republicans in the Senate from the House and from probably from the White House and from others to curtail the filibuster severely will be very strong, because the filibuster will be the one thing standing in the way of their having essentially carte blanche. And that's a whole lot to give up because of the possibility that the Democrats would reciprocate and maintain the filibuster later on. The Supreme Court is likely to change dramatically. The replacement of Scalia for Justice Scalia will probably be roughly similar to Scalia in voting patterns. So the balance will not change immediately. The trouble is that there are, from the standpoint of Democrats or liberals, is that there are three elderly judges, two of whom are among the leading liberals. Justice Ginsburg is 83 and has had cancer. Justice Breyer is 78, has not had cancer. Justice Kennedy, a moderate conservative, is often the swing voter, is 78. I think it would be likely to expect that by the end of one Trump term, 4 years, that the Supreme Court would be 7-2 strong conservatives against over liberals, and the conservatives who are there already are more conservative than judges have been. So that's a that's going to be a very, very conservative court with big consequences for policy. The one final thing to be said about the policy direction is that I think that Donald Trump's policy direction is extraordinarily unclear. So you could say the bad news is he makes policy decisions recklessly and off the top of his head, and he says things without a lot of basis or analysis. The good news is he changes his mind without much constraint, right? So he's going to be balancing a number of things. Some of his policy positions have not been consistent with Republican ideology. He has some disposition, obviously, to take practical realities into account. He's backed off already some of the positions that he's taken. And so where these policies go exactly, I think is not completely clear. I don't see anything that ought to make liberals at all confident of things working out well from their standpoint. But the Tea Party Republicans in Congress may be frustrated in a lot of what they want also. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think that for those people standing in the back, are there more chairs? So there are chairs in there. There's a couple spots up front and in the middle here. So please join us if you want to. If you want to stand up in the back, of course, you're welcome to. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Price, who will talk to us about Trump and world politics.
Like Paul, I'm not going to try and offer any sort of firm predictions or anything of that sort, but rather just raise some of the issues and implications of what we're going to have to reckon with if Trump, in fact, follows through with some of the things he said. And I'll first speak more broadly about the character of the international order and where he fits in, and then dive a little deeper into 3 or so specific issues. The pillars of the liberal international order that we've had really since World War II, among other things, have been that have been pushed by the United States have been things like democracy, a rules-based institutional order centered on openness, in particular in trade, which I imagine Werner will talk about, and alliances, which helped underpin the economic growth, particularly in Europe, and so institutions like NATO and EU. Trump campaigned against all these things. He campaigned against trade agreements, he called NATO obsolete, and he never talks about defending democracy. So these pillars are certainly under challenge. Whether he acts upon them remains to be seen, and indeed, when was the last time us cynics thought that a politician was actually going to live up to campaign promises? He'd be really unconventional if he actually did that. So remains to be seen. We usually see some slippage, as Paul has already mentioned. There's already been talk for a number of years amongst scholars who study international relations that we've been entering a period of a retreat from the liberal elements of the international order. And Trump and Brexit, I think, are just exclamation points on those larger trends. We're going to have, in my view, likely less of a rules-based kind of order, and that means declining influence of international organizations, of international institutions within by those liberal norms. See more of a reassertion of sovereignty and somewhat of a more isolationist kind of approach. And the liberal values that have existed in international organizations and institutions are going to receive less support. On the other hand, I do think Trump's going to encounter more obstacles to the things that he has proposed that he has yet to reckon with. And why is that? Well, really distinctive of Trump's approach is he sees everything as a deal. And he thinks because he's so big and tough, he can bully and get better deals on all these things. Well, what's fascinating, though, is he's going to be attempting to do so at a period in history where the U.S.'s relative power, relative to everybody else, is at its lowest ebb in the post-World War II period. Not at its highest. And that's why he keeps saying, make America great again. That's premised on, he keeps saying, America's weak, we've gotten weak under Obama and everybody else. Well, he's partially right, without over-exaggerating. But the rise of China's economic might in particular, and others, has in fact lessened the U.S. ability to achieve what it wants. So Trump's going to come up against that in a variety of ways, I think. And it's because not only does power matter, but authority matters. And the U.S. has really abandoned the kind of authority that such as it may have had at one time, to get people to more or less consent to following what the kind of order that the U.S. wants. The exception, I think, will be for illiberal governments. There's a lot that they liked in Donald Trump, and that's why I think this may be a watershed kind of election because he provides the kind of influence that only the US can provide in helping shape much broader currents in world politics. Similarly, in the Middle East, the fact that he'll prioritize counterterrorism will please many of the region's autocrats, but reformers, civil society groups, activists, and those seeking greater freedoms, they're going to be in for a really rough ride. Similarly in Europe, when you see regimes in places like Poland, Hungary, France, or candidates in places like France and the Netherlands, you see the regimes in Turkey and the Philippines. These are illiberal governments or candidates seeking office who will gain nothing but momentum from the likes of Trump. So what does this mean more specifically? If we're going to talk about the international security order, one of the biggest issues that he has raised is ripping up this nuclear deal with Iran. Okay? This was a deal which put off Iran possibly becoming the world's next nuclear weapons state for at least 15 years. It was more successful than most people thought it was going to be. It got achieved more from the perspective of achieving that goal. But Trump, as only Trump can put it, called it the stupidest deal of all time. Well, what are his options? Is he going to renegotiate and bargain hard with Iran and somehow get them to cave in? No, he's not going to be able to because it was a front-loaded deal. And Iran's already got most of what it wanted, which was unfreezing billions of dollars of its assets. That's already out the window. Secondly, if he tries to renegotiate, it's not a deal between the US and Iran. It's between 6 other powers, Germany and the Security Council permanent members, and Iran. So he can, with his authority, actually withdraw from that agreement. He has presidential power to do so. But the other 5 are unlikely to do so, as far as we can tell. They're unlikely to reimpose sanctions against Iran, as far as we can tell. So this is the kind of thing in which the US finds it enmeshed itself in this international order, and it just doesn't have the ability to unilaterally push others around as much as Donald Trump thinks they might be. The other option, of course, would be much more extreme measures, such as attacking Iran's nuclear facilities, which was long discussed in American national security circles. That died down with the Obama administration, but we may see a resurrection of that, and that would be a complete disaster. I could tell you why I think that would be such a disaster. Trump has issued impatience and expressed impatience with allies not footing their part of the bill around the world. He's not the first US president to say this. Every US president and administration has said this. What is new about Trump is suggesting explicitly, as Trump did in so many fronts, sort of crossing the taboos of nice diplomacy, that Japan and South Korea should become nuclear powers if they're not going to pay their portion of maintaining that alliance structure. Okay? That is new. What are the implications if that happens? I could talk more about it. I would say that hopefully will listen to some of his national security advisors who will remind him why 70 years of US presidents have not encouraged that step. It's in US interest to have the fewest nuclear powers around the world. Why? For Trump's objective of making America great again. America's greatness in military terms relies on its conventional superiority, not its nuclear weapons. Every other country that gets nuclear weapons gets, and I have to use the term, a trump card that they can use that kind of negates that conventional capability and superiority. Okay? Whether he'll realize that remains to be seen. NATO, again, complaining that his allies, the allies of the United States, are not footing their part of the bill. He's right. This is one area in which I think his position is totally reasonable. The problem, again, is that he's gone much further in saying, if NATO allies don't pay their part of the bill, we're not going to come to their defense. That is much more destabilizing and has a lot of countries very worried, because no US president has ever said such a thing. Okay? I'd be pretty worried if I was Latvia and Lithuania. They fall below the 2% threshold that is NATO's goal for each of its members to contribute to defense, and Trump has explicitly said, if you don't hit that 2%, we might not come to your defense. Well, those are 2 very vulnerable countries, given the fact that Russia's Putin has already shown his willingness to rescue what he calls as Russian populations who are minorities in nearby countries, namely in the eastern Ukraine and the Crimea. Okay. That's why many people think it's very destabilizing. How much time, George?
You have 3 more minutes.
Excellent, thank you. Canada's going to have some really difficult decisions because we are one of these free riders. we spend half as much on defense as our NATO aspirations supposedly commit us to. Think of doubling Canada's defense budget. We are going to get pushed really hard under a Trump administration, and this country is likely to have some really difficult decisions. I can speak more about what Canada has done in NATO to try and get in front of that. I don't think it's going to be enough. I want to conclude with some thoughts on some of these illiberal values that I think the United States under Trump would promote, and I want to focus on torture. Trump said, I would absolutely authorize something beyond waterboarding, and believe me, it would be effective. I'd bring it back, and I'd bring back a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding. This is a really bad idea. It's a bad idea for so many reasons. I have 2.5 minutes, so I'm going to skip most of them. We now know that it didn't work the way him and his supporters continually chant. There was a US Senate report of its own practices, and they didn't find a single incidence when the CIA program produced actionable intelligence that prevented a terrorist attack. Okay? Not only that, but we know it backfired, and US officials know it backfired. Their interviews of Al-Qaeda and ISIS members make very clear the single biggest recruiting tool they ever had were the US practices of torture and the treatment of detainees at Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib in Iraq. Military officials know this, and that's why the person he recently met to possibly be his new defense secretary actually articulated what isn't surprising, which most uniformed military were opposed to these practices because it exposes American soldiers to being tortured, doesn't work terribly well, and now it gives the best recruiting tool you could ever ask for extremists. So just this Tuesday in these interviews with the New York Times, he said, I was shocked when I heard, James Mattis, who's supposed to be the toughest US general ever, say, waterboarding, no, not that into it. I give a guy a pack of cigarettes and a beer, and I get more out of him than I do from waterboarding. And here's one of these things where Donald Trump said, well, I'm not saying I've changed my mind, but I was impressed by that. So maybe there's a capacity for learning. We shall see. John McCain, just this last weekend in Halifax, came out and said very explicitly, we will not waterboard, we will not torture. I'd be interested in Paul's views on this. Trump would have to change US law to do this, because the lesson learned by the CIA and the Pentagon was, if we're given orders to do these illegal things, don't do it. Because we were hung out to dry, and we were prosecuted, whereas Cheney and Rumsfeld faced no accountability. 11 US soldiers, for example, from Abu Ghraib were in fact see jail time. So they're not going to do it unless the law changes. Are they going to change the law? 2015, the Senate passed a new measure that explicitly forbade the US from engaging in torture, including waterboarding. So the US Senate would actually have to overturn that. That vote, by the way, was 78-21, making sure the US doesn't do this again, just last year. So that might be a pretty tough one. All that said, I want to conclude by saying while there are some of these restraints, the discourse is terribly damaging just the same. It's symbolic, as Paul mentioned. It has a big effect. And what held back and what spurred, conversely, the Bush administration to engage in those practices was 9/11, of course. The obvious problem then is if there is another kind of crisis that has that kind of effect, we could see these restraints overridden very quickly. We likely would. And unfortunately, the rest of Trump's foreign policy statements, especially those demonizing Islam, provide continued fodder to set the stage for just the kind of incident that would perhaps spark a return to such practices. I'll stop there.
Very much. Our next speaker is Werner Antweiler from Sauder School of Business on Trade.
Thank you very much, George. And when I was invited to talk about the economics of the possible Trump administration, I thought, well, my thinking is really shaded by two recent books I read about related topics. One is a book called What is Populism? And what I learned from this is that this Trump phenomenon isn't just a US issue, it's a much broader international issue. We see economic issues that are percolating to all Western economies, and we need to understand what's driving that. The other book I've been reading is actually by two Nobel Prize-winning economists called George Antweiler and Robert Schiller, some of you may know, and they have written a book called Fishing for Fools. It's all about people are getting duped, and it's kind of like the spam emails you're getting that invite you to participate in some scheme, you're going to get rich quick, and click on this link, and all good things will happen. Now, when it comes to economic slogans during the electoral campaign, well, you probably find a lot of people thinking about economic issues and, well, maybe not really deeply understanding them, because economics is really hard to understand. It has a lot of like indirect effects and repercussions. So it's very easy to make slogans that sound like, well, they could make things better, but they're really hard to get into some sort of coherent policy. There's a simple principle in life that says you can't have your cake and eat it too. And that principle applies in economics as well. There's really no such thing as a free lunch. More importantly, economic policies have to be internally consistent to succeed, and that means you have to have a way that thinks about repercussions. A classic example in economics of monetary policy can only have one goal, like exchange rate it can target, or nominal GDP, or inflation, but it can't actually target all of them at the same time. So it's only one or the other. Or in fiscal policy, well, you can only really do certain things at one time. For example, you can reduce taxes and boost expenditures, but that increases public debt. If you reduce public debt, you need to increase taxes or reduce expenditures. But you can't reduce debt, boost expenditures, and slash taxes all at the same time. So if you run up a huge deficit, what happens is that it has an effect on interest rates. And if they go up, then there are some other painful trade-offs to make. So politicians really have to come to grasp with all of that. And that means that when you have a new politician or businessman turned politician who thinks the country runs like a business, there's a problem, because a nation's economy doesn't run like a business. It's a lot more complex. Businesses can go bankrupt, and I think Donald Trump knows a thing or two about that. And countries don't go bankrupt, but when things go wrong, a lot of people are hurting and suffer. So enter the era of populism in the 21st century. And when I mentioned it's not just a US phenomenon, think about Brexit, think about the rise of populism in a lot of European countries, and think about Poland and other places as well. We have to kind of worry about that. It's what is driving that. So if a US administration comes in and says, well, we can bring jobs back to America and we make America great again, whatever that may mean, can that actually succeed? And when I look at it, when Donald Trump is forming his administration, we're wondering about what he actually stands for, because he's made all kinds of claims, bombastic, and he's used divisive rhetoric during the campaign. Did he just say all of that to get attention and get elected? Or is he actually going to carry out what he actually promised? And can he do that actually with the help of Congress? Now, is Donald Trump, the president, more pragmatic than Donald Trump, the candidate? There's really only one certainty with him, I think, and that is that there is no certainty with him. And that means that what he says today may not be true tomorrow. And what matters is really what he does and what the administration does and Congress does. Now, the economic policies of the Trump administration, the way he's been announcing some of them, really remind me of this Italo-Western, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And so let me talk about those policies that we can put into those three categories. Let me start with the good, and there is some. The one policy most economists think could be helpful is to provide more fiscal stimulus. Now, we've sort of exhausted our potential to use monetary policy to stimulate the economy. We have record low interest rates, and they can go really much lower. They can get a little negative, but we're sort of exhausted that policy. So a lot of countries, including Canada, have been thinking that we may need to spend more on infrastructure. And to that extent that Trump and Clinton were proposing doing this, that may be actually very helpful. Now, unfortunately, the US government, the federal government that is in a poor position to carry out a lot of that, because first of all, most of their procurement is actually only in one sector, which is military goods. And a lot of the spending that really needs to occur is more at the state level, like think bridges and road work and other infrastructure and public transit and what have you not. So a Trump administration would need broad cooperation from the states to succeed. Congress would also have to approve large expenditure increases, and whether the US Congress will write that check means to be seen. Congress may well reduce taxes for people, but these are unlikely to generate much stimulus if it benefits mostly the rich, because instead of creating jobs through higher demand, most of that will just inflate asset prices and do very little to boost economic opportunities. So what do we see? Equity markets are buoyant, they're going up, but bond markets are going down. So what does that mean? Well, when bond markets go down, that means there is a fear of higher inflation. And so that's related to the prospect that Trump administration would be borrowing a lot of money and maybe even recklessly. Now, also there are trade-offs. Too much fiscal stimulus, and the Federal Reserve will have to increase interest rates, which they are proposing to do already in December. And the economy is near capacity, so any more too aggressive stimulus could actually really quickly translate into inflation rather than more economic activity. There's yet another catch. If Trump's policies amount to borrowing a lot more money, this money has to come from somewhere. You can borrow it locally, and a lot of it has always been, the US has been borrowing from abroad. And when you have large capital inflows, you also have to generate a lot of imports to match that. That's basic economics 101. And so a fiscal stimulus would draw in lots of imports, and that sort of defeats some of the other promises Trump has made, which is balancing the big trade deficit the United States has. So again, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So now to the bad economic policies. So Trump wants to take the wrecking ball to international trade agreements. He's already announced that he wants to withdraw from TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And he's also very likely to abandon the trade deal on the other side of the country, namely the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with the European Union. Now, it's very easy to abandon some of these trade negotiations because, well, they're at a certain stage, you can just give up on that, and now that's easy to do by executive order. It's much more difficult to withdraw from existing treaties, and I think the US administration and Congress will be much more reluctant to open the door too widely there because they will also stand to lose something. Now, tearing up NAFTA, as Trump has promised, would indeed have pretty big economic effects because the US economy is integrated across the border. The auto sector between Ontario and Michigan, for example, and the maquiladora across the border from Texas, they integrated. So basically, once you disrupt the trade flows, you're going to disrupt a lot of economic activities and make a lot of businesses unhappy, and a lot of jobs will be at stake. Now, what about Canada? We'll likely come out okay, I think, because there is so much at stake and there are so many benefits to US businesses from trade with Canada. That doesn't mean there are not sore points where we'll see a lot of negotiations going on. Softwood lumber has traditionally been one area where we have had a lot of trouble. We have gone from one agreement to another, and very likely there will be yet another one. To what extent that deal will last, we'll see. But in the long run, cheaper Canadian products benefit a lot of American consumers, and they are our best ally because they benefit from the lower price of Canadian goods coming into the United States. So can Trump bring jobs back to America? He claims trade for most of the economic woes has now befallen middle-class America. So basically it's the old blame the foreigners attitude, which we've heard probably before. So this element we've seen in the 1930s too, where the proliferation of high tariffs and the introduction of foreign exchange and capital controls led to eventually the Great Depression. And restoring a trading system took a lot of decades after World War II. There's also, and that's really fundamentally the big problem, there's a lot of disparity in the economies in the Western world, and they have increased. One of the scariest charts in economics is when you look at the increase in economic disparity in the last 25 years. That number has gone up not just in the United States, and they're kind of at the top of that league, but it has gone up in virtually every other economy, including like Sweden or Finland, that you may not suspect having had these big increases in disparity. But we have them, so what to do about that? So to understand this malaise that's led a lot of people to vote for Donald Trump, one has to really understand why are they feeling left behind and cannot be fixed. But the problem is, the Trump diagnosis is really wrong to start this because he looks at it as trade is to blame, when in fact it's manufacturing jobs that have gone away due to what we call as economists skill-based technological progress. So that's automation, that's your robots working 24/7. So these jobs, they won't come back ever. They have been innovated away. So we have to kind of think about what are the other ways how to fix these issues with jobs. These new jobs will mostly come in different sectors, in the service sector that require skill upgrading, training, education, topics that Trump has been quite silent on. So just how bad is Trump's policy on trade going to be? There are really two vastly different scenarios. One is there's just going to be some tougher negotiation. He's appointed this 70-year-old billionaire investor, Wilbur Ross, as Commerce Secretary, and which sort of suggests he may actually pursue a hard line. So the Trump administration is likely to treat countries like Mexico badly because that's what they intended to do. But there's also, again, economic repercussions. What's already happened is that the Mexican peso has gone down, way down. And so even if you impose a new tariff of 20%, let's say, well, Mexican products are getting cheaper because the Mexican peso is getting cheaper. So things actually react in the economy, and there are consequences of making even statements as opposed to even introducing policies. Another scenario is, of course, it could be trade war. Now, that's something he has announced at various points, imposing like 45% tariffs on Chinese products. But again, this is something where there will be repercussions. One is he's going to hurt his own consumers. And the people who go into the local Walmart and buy goods, well, a lot of them are from China. And if they get more expensive, that's going to hurt exactly the people who voted for him. The other part is that countries will retaliate. If I build a tariff wall against your goods, you can build a tariff wall against my goods. And that is basically the standard logic of international trade. You basically have to realize that whatever you do domestically will have international repercussions. And in fact, China has various opportunities to hurt American producers, such as farmers, aircraft producers, and a few others. And lastly, the ugly policies. He's said he's going to expel millions of immigrants. And in addition to the economic and social hardship that is going to cause, again, that's also going to backfire because it means he's going to take demand out of the US economy. These are people who are providing valued labor, and who's going to fill these positions? This is all about the sort of us against them politics that you find throughout many of the populists in Europe as well, including the people who have been arguing for Brexit. So another policy I want to just briefly mention that sort of takes a little bit to hopefully not the thunder away from Cassie is about climate policy, and because Trump has announced he wants to do something about coal, which is boost the coal markets again. Now, that is something where markets will overturn that already because, hey, natural gas has been a lot cheaper in recent years due to fracking, and that's not going to go away. So there's no way of bringing back coal without realizing that, hey, this natural gas market is going to be the one that businesses will buy from because it's cheaper. The same goes for oil. Oil prices are so low that we're not going to see a huge amount of new development. And on the other hand, and that's most reassuring, the prices for wind and solar are coming down. And to the extent that they're getting cheaper and can survive without subsidies, and in Europe they already do in many instances, they will take over. Because if it's going to be cheaper to build wind farms and solar farms, and you don't need the fossil fuel to the same extent, then this is where the development is going. And we already see that the installed capacity that's installed in a given year has been really going up for renewables, and they're actually dominating the picture in part of Europe. So finally, where is the Trump administration going? We don't know. We can speculate, we can worry, but only one thing is for sure: we can't afford the US to go off the rails economically. If the US engine sputters, that's bad news for everybody. And so what about the voters? Eventually, they'll realize that Trump's policies can't deliver because they're logically inconsistent economically. And no amount of linguistic bravado or tweets will have the fact that the emperor has no clothes. So I think Hillary Clinton was right when she said to Trump during one of the debates that Trump lives in an alternative reality. The thing is, reality always catches up to you. It always does. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And our final speaker is Professor Kathryn Harrison on energy and climate policies.
I've only got the bad and the ugly for you. The good part, can't come up with one at the moment. A little bit of background, and then what I want to say is a bit about what kinds of things Donald Trump has proposed to do in terms of climate and energy policy in the US, and what are the implications then for Canada. So the background, first and foremost, as all of the previous speakers have said, this is, if nothing else, an unpredictable person. He makes policy announcements by the seat of his pants without regard to evidence or expert advice. So we don't really know what he will do. That's kind of good news, given the sorts of things he's talked about, the bits of background that are a little more troubling are that the issue right now isn't just that Donald Trump has won the presidency, it's that there will be Republican majorities in Congress, where the Republican Party leadership, 201, reject the scientific consensus on climate change. So this is a real combo that hasn't been in place for many, many years. And the last bit is that President Obama has not been able to pass legislation to reduce U.S. greenhouse gases, to advance clean energy. And given that, what he's done is taken full advantage of his executive authority. He's pursued regulatory actions within existing legislation. To the extent that what he's done is use his executive discretion, one of the implications is that it is relatively easy for his successor to undo those actions because he has discretion as well. So what has Mr. Trump said about climate and energy? First off, on the science, a few years ago, he tweeted that, quote, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. Now, it says a lot about where we are, that the policy positions that I'm pointing to come from a tweet. He, however, did not take the opportunity to disavow that position during the campaign, which is not surprising because it's pretty consistent with the Republican Party leadership. Some people were pretty reassured that in his recent interview with the New York Times, Mr. Trump says that he now has an open mind. But I think the actual text of what he said to the Times is less assuring. And I will quote, I can't do the SNL imitation, so I'll just read it straight as best I can. My uncle was for 35 years a professor at MIT. He was a great engineer, scientist. He was a great guy. And he was, a long time ago, he had feelings. This was a long time ago. He had feelings on this subject. It's a very complex subject. I'm not sure anybody is ever really going to know. I know they say they have science on one side, but then they also have these horrible emails that were sent between the scientists. Where was it? In Geneva or wherever 5 years ago? Terrible. Where they got caught, so you see that and you say, what's this all about? I absolutely have an open mind. I will tell you this, clean air is vitally important, clean water, crystal clean water is vitally important, science is vitally important. And you mentioned a lot, the courses. We have some great, great golf courses. I've received so many environmental awards for what I've done, I've done a tremendous amount of work where I've received tremendous numbers. Sometimes I'll say I'm actually an environmentalist and people will smile in some cases, and other people that know me understands it's true, open mind. So I'm feeling less reassured by that interview than many have. So that's where we are on the science. With respect to international affairs, President-elect Trump has indicated that he will pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. I think it's one of the many things he said he would do on his first day in office. It's actually a bit difficult to get out of the Paris Agreement. It would take many years, but the U.S. could withdraw from the Framework Convention on Climate Change in just 1 year. On the other hand, he did say it's one of the things he has an open mind about in that interview with the New York Times. There will be pressure from the rest of the countries of the world, including China, to have the U.S. stay in that agreement. So we'll see. Reversing or not moving forward with regulations that the Obama administration has adopted with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it's not as easy to just stop and undo as you might think, because those regulations in the U.S. Were predicated on a 2007 Supreme Court decision and a follow-up action by the Obama administration, where it was declared under the U.S. Clean Air Act that CO2 is an endangerment to public health and well-being. Once that declaration was made, there are certain requirements for the executive branch to pursue regulations, but there's a lot of flexibility in what those regulations could be. So I think it would be hard to undo the endangerment finding. In theory, President-elect Trump, working with a Republican Congress, could amend the U.S. Clean Air Act. I think that would be difficult to do as well because of the filibuster that Professor Quirk already mentioned. Even Ronald Reagan, who, when he was elected, wanted to revise all kinds of environmental laws, was not successful in doing that. But what the Bush administration can do is drag their feet Trump can do is drag their feet and do nothing for many years, which is what the Bush administration did before them. He has promised to repeal the Clean Power Plan regulations. That would take some time unless a new U.S. Supreme Court with new President Trump appointees simply rejected the Clean Power Plan when it comes to them, which is a real possibility. The Obama administration has also been moving forward quite actively in regulating greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, both light-duty vehicles, cars, and heavy-duty vehicles, big trucks. And that's significant and will continue to be significant for many years, but we can't really afford, given that we're nowhere near on track for the 2C international target, to stall that process and just freeze the existing standards, let alone roll them back. And the final thing I would say that President-elect Trump has said is he's just a big fan of fossil fuels. He likes them a lot. He has offered to end the war on coal. I think that was quite a helpful thing with his the base that he was seeking support from in the election. Like Werner, that's one where I'm not that worried in the short term because the quite dramatic change in the U.S.'s reliance on coal for producing electricity, shifting from coal to natural gas, is for the most part unrelated to regulations. It's simply an economic matter and will continue to be an economic matter. What we may see, though, is if the Trump administration increases access to coal leases, coal mining leases, there will be increasing pressure for U.S. production of coal for export, including through Vancouver. And oil. Keystone XL, I think that's another one. Reverse President Obama's rejection of the Keystone XL pipeline on his first day in office. That's one where I think there will be strong support within the U.S. Congress, although the decision is a bit complicated procedurally, but I think that could be done, assuming the proponent comes back and asks for another kick at the can. But there will be formidable public opposition to that pipeline. It'll be interesting to see how much that pipeline, the opposition against that pipeline on the U.S. sort of side of the border could matter. So what are all the implications for Canada? There is a temptation to think that this is just unprecedented. We've never been here before, but in fact, we were in a remarkably similar situation 15 years ago. The U.S. and Canada marched in tandem in negotiating commitments in the Kyoto Protocol. And then in one of his first actions as president, George W. Bush announced that the U.S. would not ratify the Kyoto Protocol after all. In response to that, there was increasing pressure, really quite formidable opposition from the business community, from provincial governments, from opposition parties. Because it's increasingly difficult for Canada as a country whose economy is so closely integrated with that of the U.S. to proceed with costly regulation of greenhouse gas emissions if our main trading partner is not doing the same. Now, initially, it was pretty encouraging that despite the U.S.'s withdrawal, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien said, we're going ahead anyway. Canada ratified the Kyoto Protocol even without the U.S. on board, and then we did nothing. We really just took no action to achieve our targets, and our emissions just kept going up until the global recession. So that makes me quite nervous about where we are today, even though the Trudeau government, like the Chrétien government before it, has said, don't worry, we're going to stay the course. So what are some of the concrete implications? The first, I think, is that the U.S.'s withdrawal increases the political challenge of implementing the $50 per ton carbon price that Mr. Trudeau announced last month. There will be increasing pressure from emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors, and we've already started to hear that. 2 minutes? Okay. The Conservatives' interim leader has said that it is insanity to proceed with that policy. I think it empowers provincial opposition, but the situation is a bit different than it was 15 years ago. That opposition is mostly concentrated in Saskatchewan right now, and there's a bit of a détente with Alberta if they get a pipeline, one or more pipelines. I'll come back to that. I do think that The interesting thing about Canada's carbon pricing plan that was announced is it's basically a carbon pricing plan that is designed to salvage fossil fuel production for export. So we are reducing emissions from certain sectors and in practice certain regions in order to allow the fossil fuel industry to increase its production. And in that sense, I think how this will play out at this point is a little more invisible, because I don't expect that we will achieve the kinds of reductions that are needed from all of those other sectors to meet our target to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. And instead, what we would likely do is rely more heavily, even than was the case before Donald Trump's election, on international offsets. So in essence, we will be paying other countries not to buy our oil. Keystone XL probably hasn't been a better time to be in the oil industry in Canada for many years than it is right now. I expect that we will probably see approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. We will probably in the next few days see approval of the Trans Mountain expansion as well. And those two pipelines, the production of oil associated with those pipelines, not counting the actual burning of the oil, is likely to increase Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by 33 to 38 million tons per year. That's huge. So the Trump's approval increases emissions in Canada. Canada has very much been a policy taker in regulation of the motor vehicle industry. So if the US either slows down or stops tightening its regulations for cars and trucks, there's a good chance that Canada will stall as well there. And the final point I would make, and this one's a bit of a wild card, is that I think that Mr. Trump's election destabilizes the Alberta climate plan. The Notley government proposed a carbon price, and it was kind of a deal that we will impose a carbon price on certain sectors, we'll phase out coal in the electricity industry, but in exchange we will allow emissions from the oil industry to grow by 50%. And the deal was we need to improve our reputation in order to secure markets for our exports. Well, it's not clear anymore that the US really cares what the reputation for Canadian oil is. And if so, that could result in a change in government in Alberta, and then we could see much stronger opposition to the federal government's carbon pricing plan. And that's important because almost all of the projected growth in Canada's emissions comes from Alberta. So I think this is a real moment of truth in Canadian climate policy. We have failed many times before. I would love to believe that won't be the case this time, but I'm pretty worried. Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we covered some areas of concern, obviously not all of them. But we have plenty of time for some comments and questions. I'd appreciate it if you'd introduce yourself and relatively quickly ask one of or more of the panelists a question. So would anyone? Yes, Professor Holstein.
I'd like to ask Paul Quirk if he made some comments about the relationship between Trump and the Republicans, particularly with the Senate. It seems to be something in the conversation here that he's lining up 100% support among 51 senators. Is this likely to be true on all policy issues?
No, I think it's not clear at all. The Republicans are fairly unified in Congress on a conventional conservative position. They'd be pretty likely to get all 51 or 52 of them supporting their, a couple of moderates that they sometimes have difficulty with. The issue is that there are some policies, like trade policy is the best example probably, but then also some aspects of budget policy like spending on entitlements, Social Security and Medicare, where Trump's campaign positions have been in conflict with Republican orthodoxy. And that was quite well known. And I would say that it was quite striking that almost no elected Republicans wanted to oppose Trump for re-election. I mean, for election, they almost all endorsed him or else didn't speak to the matter. But I don't think it's at all clear that they will feel obliged to agree with his policy positions. That is, there's potential for a lot of conflict between Trump and Republicans on those matters where he's out of line with standard policy. There are other areas where, like as Kathy was saying, climate policy seems to be lined up with where they are already, and there's some things where we don't know. He goes further on immigration policy and anti-terrorism policy than some of them do. I think there's a lot of room for conflict, a lot of basis for expecting conflict between Trump and the Republicans on some important issues.
Another question over here.
Owen, Polly, and Econ. The question I have is Trump signaled that he's going to drop TPP, and with the most likely that ISF is going to pass in later this year or early next year. Does that signal that the U.S. is losing its influence in trade policy in Asia Pacific, and with the passing of reset, would that mean that China will have a greater influence in trade policy in the Asia Pacific region after the TPP?
Yeah, it's very important to consider who's actually part of TPP and who's not. And China is not part of the TPP negotiations. So usually TPP was actually viewed as a counterweight to Chinese influence in Asia. And so abandoning TPP actually enhances China's position. So it's something that's not necessarily unwelcome from their perspective in China. So what happens afterwards now is the question, will there be more bilateral agreements? There are several other regional trade agreements that are proceeding in Asia, and I think some of them will continue to go ahead and maybe even more invigorated now that TPP is not proceeding. So I think we will see a new constellation of trade partners without the United States.
Any other panelists have comments on the TPP trade issue? Okay, there was a question back there.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Shana Plow, and I'm also an American who's now here in Canada. So I speak from this in a personal way as well as from an academic perspective. And that's wondering in what way can there be leverage for change? And here I'm thinking about in the past when there have been governmental policies in the United States, usually one can speak in the opposition to American values to try and persuade there to be Americans don't torture or Americans wouldn't be discriminatory on the basis of ethnicity, etc. Although we know that that's not true. But in what way can leverage be harnessed to try and not have the train go completely to the wall?
I try to avoid personally adopting quite such partisan characterizations myself, but to take the substance of your question, I think that we're going to see a lot of resistance to the Trump administration, and probably much more protest, potentially sometimes violent protest. I wouldn't be surprised to see rioting at times. I think this will be a very, very conflictual administration. I think that some of that, from the standpoint of people supporting the values that you refer to, I think some of this protest and violence could be constructive. That is, I think a president or a leader incurs costs when it's observed that their policies and their behavior are eliciting such strong resistance and anger. So I think there will be, there's very little you can do to change the minds of Republicans in Congress, but I think he may become highly unpopular very quickly, and resistance could play a role in that.
Dick?
I just wanted to add that after my own personal, shock at the result of the election, which I think I would share with you, that the, little glimmers of hope were reflecting on the fact that, 27% of the American electorate voted for Trump. That's a really small percentage. I mean, I expected him to get around 30, and I thought, great, he can never win with 30, and he won with even less. That's what was shocking to me. I mean, 2 million votes he lost in the popular vote. So on the one hand, we ought not perhaps to overestimate his amount of popular cultural support. But on the other hand, that voice for change, well, 50% of Americans didn't vote. That's where a lot of source for change lies, surely.
And on the international front, though, in terms of speaking about this internationally and leverage in that sense?
Well, if I would just continue and say a few words, that's what worries me greatly in some regards, is that the leverage, that's precisely the question, is, to put it really crudely, who's the leader of the free world? Justin Trudeau? Angela Merkel? Who else is there right now that's going to defend the kinds of concerns that you and others would articulate? This is a tough time to be standing up for freedom of the press, traditional sorts of liberal freedoms, freedom against torture, freedom against discrimination. There are many illiberal governments in power. Canada may well face an investigation by the International Criminal Court based on its practices in Afghanistan, investigating the US and Canada. Is Canada going to stand up and do the right thing or resist that? That's going to be a really tough place to be. But if it doesn't, who's left?
Kathy, did you want to?
I'm
chime in?
not, I'm skeptical of an appeal to American values making a difference on environment and climate change in the same way. It hasn't worked in either Canada or the US for the last 25 years. People like to say, yeah, act on climate change, but they don't want to take the bus and get out of their cars. So there's been a lot of hypocrisy there, and that gives politicians a fair amount of wiggle room. Like Paul, I think we've already seen in the US thousands of people arrested over the Keystone XL pipeline. People chained themselves to the White House fence and circled the White House. I think those kinds of protests we've already seen in the case of the Dakota pipeline are going to get rougher. They're going to be more on the front lines and less symbolic. I expect there will be more violence. And then the interesting question is, there's two ways those kinds of protests can work. One is by appealing to the hearts and minds of the electorate at large, and for that to happen, I think there need to be some grandmothers and soccer moms and dads out on those front lines. The other alternative is that they just make it difficult to build things, to get in the way of the construction company and so on. And I'm kind of skeptical of how long that can work, because there are lots of police who are willing to do a lot to move protesters when push comes to shove.
Okay, I've got 4 people lined up to speak. I did want to ask one question, because I kind of want to build on this about where there might be pockets of pressure or resistance for change. So far, we've been talking about national level politics in the US and international politics, but one of the things that I would anticipate would happen is really extraordinary leaders emerging from the state levels or from the big cities. So maybe Jerry Brown will become the leader of the free world instead of the President of the United States. I was wondering if any of you have comments on that.
On climate change, that's quite an important dynamic, where California really has been a leader in their economies, similar in size to Canada's. They've said they're going to stay the course, and I think that's encouraging in some respects and overblown in others. It's encouraging because California has a special deal under the U.S. Clean Air Act that allows them, and only them, to set motor vehicle emission standards that depart from the national standards. And if California does it, all of the other states have the option to either go with the California standard or the federal standard. So California already pushed the federal government to go as far as they did. So we may see action there. Be interesting to see how Canada responds. As to whether California's leadership could proceed and spill over to other states in the absence of the federal government, that's where I think it's kind of overblown, because we've seen clean states following California's lead, and the dirty states, the ones who have the most to lose, are the ones that aren't following California's leads. They're the ones where the federal government's backup of California's policies are most important.
Okay, so a question here, please.
Yes, this is for Ethan Barrett. This is for Professor Quirk and Price. I'm wondering, I know Professor Quirk said capitulating wasn't as important, but what does this recent election and the Brexit poll say about how effective polls have become, that they failed to get the two biggest votes we've had in recent years, and what does that mean for the future if we can't even predict what's going to happen?
I might follow polls more closely than Richard does. I would say they are somewhat different cases. One thing is that as the vote continues to be counted, the predictions about the presidential election come closer to being accurate. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by a bit over 1%, getting close to 2%. And the polls were saying that she would win by 4 or 5% nationally. The error was a little larger in swing states, but this is not a huge thing, a huge error. Error in a presidential election poll comes primarily from two things. First, let me say it's not at all from sampling error. You know, when you hear about the margin of error, that's because that has to do with there being a sufficiently small sample that the sample can be different from what you would get if you did the same thing over again and just got different people. These forecasts are based on aggregating dozens or even hundreds of polls, and so the sample size that they have altogether is enormous, and sampling error by itself is 0. But there is error because for at least two reasons. One is that some people might not speak frankly. In some kinds of elections, that has been demonstrated to be the case. There's some suspicion that some people who were going to vote for Trump didn't like to tell poll takers that they were going to vote for Trump. The other thing, which I think is more likely to be important in this case, is that poll takers are always estimating who is actually going to turn out because of the fact that only about half of them turn out. All the way through, you're making a guess as to the relative probability that different groups of your sample are actually going to turn out to vote. And you can get that wrong, and I think that's probably the main thing that they got wrong. On the error in Brexit reflects the fact largely that latter kind of error about who's actually going to turn out is much larger in an unusual kind of election where you don't have experience. You know, people who are estimating the turnout for presidential elections are comparing poll results to poll results and then turnout in prior presidential elections. But when you're estimating how many people are actually going to turn out for something like Brexit, you've got nothing to compare it to. And large errors are more important. We also had, of course, a large error in the British Columbia provincial elections last time. So I do think it's fair for us to conclude that we should recognize that there is potential for error, 2-3%, above what people are saying is sampling error if they have sampling error. You know, so we probably don't know what's going to happen quite as much as we thought we did.
So, Werner, you're involved with election markets. So you have any thoughts about polling errors?
Yeah, basically, of course, it's always a probabilistic statement. So basically, even Nate Silver's 538.com was predicting 70% versus 30%. So there's a 30% chance that there's a different outcome, and that's the outcome we saw. So the sampling that they do based on the state level data is quite important. But as Paul was really saying, it's really who shows up to vote. And when you ask people in a poll who's a likely voter and who's a decided voter, and then you have to reapportion the people who say, well, I'm undecided who I'm going to vote for. And a lot of this may actually not be done quite accurately because the pollsters have to use weighting algorithms and based on their reading of how to apportion undecided voters. And if a lot of the undecided voters all turn one way as opposed to split them as based on the people who have already said how they're going to vote, you may get very wrong answers. And I think poll after poll has been wrong now. Can we really trust these polls? I think we have to really be very cautious interpreting polls because we don't know who really shows up and votes. A lot of elections are swayed by the non-voters, who shows up and who stays at home. And if people aren't enthusiastic about their usual preference, they may stay at home. And if people are particularly excited about their candidate this time, they're going to go and show up. And so this dynamic about the non-voters is something that polls have been very difficult to get a handle on.
Professor Gulati.
And I have a question for Kathryn. So you talked about Justin Trudeau's balance of trying to get Alberta on side and then having $50 tax. And I don't know, firstly, how important Alberta is in the entire $50 tax. I personally feel it's fairly important. And my instinct was when Trump got elected was that this would make it somewhat easier for Justin Trudeau because Alberta is concerned about getting over the market. And the Keystone Pipeline may allow it, and I agree that Alberta did its policy to satisfy, to look like clean oil, to say, okay, we want policy so we can get oil in the market. And I'm not sure how much of that came from Obama or it came from ground level opposition in the U.S., which hasn't gone right. So I feel like having Trump there may actually make it a little bit easier because now you have a supporter, but you still have the ground level opposition, and then that makes it easier for Justin Trudeau to keep going with the $50 tax.
Interesting, I hadn't thought about it that way. I think for the most part, the pressure came externally. Polls as recently as a couple years ago that I've seen show that Alberta was the one province where a majority of adults polled didn't believe climate change was caused by human activity. So this is not a really green electorate to start with. And I think it was the president dragging his heels so long on the decision on Keystone XL and then ultimately rejecting it was the external pressure that if we don't clean up our act, clean up our reputation, we won't be able to sell our oil. And thus far, all of the Canadian oil that's been exported has been going to the US. So that has been the main market. And I think the Republicans taking charge of both Congress and the White House undermines that argument significantly. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind is that because Alberta has already designed its own plan, which only taxes the $50 per ton, even if they get to that, on the oil industry is only at the margin. They're not being taxed on the whole amount. I mean, it's a pretty sweet deal for the oil industry relative to everyone else in the province. It really is a provincial policy that will be different than the other provinces and one that was designed to prop up emissions growth in the oil industry.
Okay, and a question here.
My question is to all four panelists on the nature of the question. You see Trump flip-flopping on issues since last September. So do you see with his cabinet appointees that perhaps his cabinets would be a lot more influential on his decision-making than we're giving them credit for? So, like, maybe he changes the way he thinks or his approach to foreign and domestic policy.
I hope so.
Leadership more than any of us, perhaps, I don't know.
Could you repeat? I missed some of that. And
Sorry,
it can be a little slower for me.
You see, Trump's elected Trump's in a very interesting cabinet so far. He really has his view in the past and along many others. So, and he has been quite flip-flopping on his issues. There's no clear stance on his issues in many cases. So do you see his cabinet being highly influential in deciding his executive powers and how he plans to use them?
Will his cabinet be influential?
The cabinet in the United States has become less and less influential over quite a long period of time, steadily. The president kind of has complete discretion over whether to rely on cabinet members or rather on White House staff people, advisors who are in the White House. So there's a conflict frequently between the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State. Both are foreign policy officials. The trend has been to weaken cabinet officers, and that's likely to continue. And the reason for it is that presidents have learned that cabinet officers develop interests and perspectives that are more in conflict with the White House view, and they have marginalized them more. So I don't think you can. I don't think you should be reading the tea leaves about who exactly gets into the cabinet, even as much as who are the White House advisors.
And would you anticipate, given what we know about Trump's executive style, it's unlikely that he's going to be more deferential to cabinet ministers than other recent presidents?
Yes, right. But I think the main thing is that people who study public administration or political scientists will just say letting cabinet members make these decisions doesn't work. Nobody even argues for it. anymore among people who are expert. What Trump's personal style of decision-making will be, I think is pretty mysterious at this point. He seems to be willing to listen to people sometimes, people you wouldn't expect him to be willing to listen to. He had a meeting with Obama and came out of it saying that he thought the Obamacare maybe was a little better than he thought it was. I wouldn't discount his being willing to listen to cabinet officers or anybody else, but the tendency has not been for cabinet officers to be the principal policymakers, even for their own area.
Okay, thanks. Yes, please.
This is a somewhat related question, but towards the beginning of your talk, you said, Trump's racism, sexism probably won't have much policy. Won't have a policy influence. But then later you said he's likely to be the most influential president since Roosevelt. Just one man. So I'm curious how you can.
Yeah. So. What I would say is that let's take issues relating to gender or race, right? I would say that in the first place, it's not clear what his policy preferences are on those matters as policy. He claims his behavior toward women has, in many instances, been atrocious, but he talks a pretty good game about, using women in positions of leadership. He has some record of doing that in his businesses. And his early appointments include some women. On matters of race, I would say much the same thing. He claims not to be racist and so forth. I think he may end up lining up with Republicans on those policies, but I don't see him as being able or particularly wanting to do something more, radical or concerted, opposed to those interests than what Republicans would ordinarily be doing. So what I'm saying is, on issues affecting gender, think of him as a Republican, not as someone who has committed a sexual assault.
I got to jump in on this one, because there are policies and then there's the bully pulpit. And there's now a bully with the bully pulpit. Someone who has boasted about sexually assaulting women, someone who has said that all Muslims need to be registered and banned from the country. Now, we don't know if he will continue such extreme language, but I fear that some really ugly genies have been let out of the bottle. And I also think that on something like gender, just being with the Republicans has profound implications for women. Having President Trump appoint several members of the Supreme Court means overturning Roe v. Wade. That's huge.
Planned Parenthood funding is another major issue.
So let me just clarify that. I don't actually disagree with what Kathryn is saying. I'm saying that on behavior toward women, I think it's likely that he has committed multiple crimes, of sexual assault. Right? That's putting him far out of the Republican mainstream, right? And what I'm saying is that these aspects of personal behavior, which were very important in the campaign, I don't think are likely to be important in governing. But I think
and you're talking about policy, which is a bit different from.
Yeah, no, actually, so I don't think he's going to make statements demeaning of women as president. I think he'll stop doing that. But I think, so I think he very likely will look for a judge that will, justices that will support overturning Roe versus Wade.
Okay, thanks. Next was David Tyndall.
So my original question has mostly been answered. I was going to ask Kathy something to the effect of focusing on, for people who are concerned about climate change, focusing on other actors than the federal government. you know, to what extent is there leverage at the international level? So people like Naomi Klein have said that, you know, especially with regard to the Paris Agreement, you know, Klein said that, you know, countries should think about imposing sanctions on the U.S. if the U.S. withdraws. Nicolas Sarkozy floated the idea of maybe having a carbon tax on U.S. exports if they withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Is there any leverage? You know, does China or Germany have sort of moral suasion or not?
I mean, I do think there will be a lot of pressure from the international community if the U.S. withdraws. How much the U.S. cares remains to be seen. We didn't see those kinds of trade sanctions last time. I'd be interested to see what Werner thinks. The one other point of resistance that I think could be important and probably more influential is from the U.S. business community. So there are very dirty sectors who benefit from burning fossil fuels, but there has been a growing clean sector. And the question is, do they have enough critical mass right now? Are they present in enough states? You know, right down to people who install solar panels, even if those solar panels are made in China, their business in the US is dependent on cheap solar panels. So the question in my mind is whether there is a lobby for free trade within the US in ways that will support the US staying in a climate agreement.
Thoughts, Werner?
Yeah, so the idea of carbon border adjustments has come up repeatedly on basically putting a sort of a carbon tariff on imports of goods that contain a lot of carbon from countries that use a lot of carbon. Now, there are some challenges actually introducing that. No country has tried so far because it would probably face a lot of challenges before the World Trade Organization, as you would have to differentiate tariffs across countries, and that's actually not so quite consistent with the most favored nation rule in trade. So it actually creates a lot of problems. The other thing is that for the United States, the emission intensity has been going down. It's mostly driven by actually replacing coal by natural gas. So we already see the US actually not really as increasing as much as, say, China. So a lot of the emissions that we see today that are increasingly from China. So the target here is probably not the United States in terms of those measures, but it would actually affect other countries like China a whole lot more than the United States if countries were introducing carbon border adjustments.
It would hurt Europe.
Yes, please.
My name is Mohammed. I'm a student in political science and economics. My question is as follows. How credible do you think Trump's campaign promises are? Many accounts project that Trump may not act in parallel with his campaign rhetoric. Is it even feasible for him to do so?
Do you have any particular promises in mind?
For instance, banning Muslims, you know, things that may be in violation of constitutional rights.
So one thing, there's a literature that political scientists have developed of tracing how much presidents actually follow through on their promises. And the main finding of this literature is to surprise people that they mostly do. That is, they actually at least propose most of the things that they promise to propose. Presidents in the United States can't get everything that they want done. But I think the Trump case is really quite distinctive, and that's because a high percentage of what he would say on a given day appeared to have absolutely no thought or analysis behind it, and frequently to be completely implausible on substantive policy grounds. On something like banning Muslims from entering the country, that's unconstitutional, and Congress would not support it. And if he tried to do something that accomplished a big part of that through executive orders in some area, it would get struck down by the courts. And I would anticipate that this is one of the kinds of things that he'll back off of. And probably, it occurs to me that one of his main tactics might be to say, "I never said that."
Just kidding.
Any other panelists have responses to that?
I just have a colleague at Brown University, Peter Andreas, who's an expert on transnational crime and narcotics, and he's weighed in on the wall question. Is he really going to build a wall? And the fact is, there already is partly a wall in the form of a fence and many fences and many other kinds of barriers. So, when he says the wall, it's as if there's nothing there and he's going to build this thing out of Game of Thrones that, nobody will be able to get over. So the reality is, as many have said here, is actually quite different than the rhetoric. He will probably engage in some building of additional things, and he'll probably build a few spectacular ones that'll look really good. But is he actually going to seal the entire, I think it's 3,000 kilometers of the border? Good luck if it's only
You
one
can make
term.
a tower instead of a wall, and just.
Did you have a question you wanted to? Yeah, maybe if I just add to that point, so how effective is a wall or a fence? And the answer is, well, if you make it stricter, you're just going to entice more smugglers to charge higher fees for bringing people across. So the only thing that's going to happen is that he's going to make a whole lot of rich smugglers bringing more people across, but it won't stop it. And so the simple thing is that these things don't work, not in a liberal democracy like the United States.
The other good line I heard was, if he builds a 12-foot wall, there'll be a huge market in Mexico for 17-foot ladders.
So did you have a question? No? Okay, then back there.
Hi, so my name's Nelson, and I'm an econ honors major. So I'm just wondering, given Trump's electoral victory, but also the rise in other anti-establishment candidates, if there's going to be any implications on corporate lobbying.
Implications for what was the last part?
Corporate lobbying.
Corporate lobbying.
So he says that he is going to crack down on corporate lobbying. An interesting element of that is that during the campaign, he would he'd say, well, I gave money to all these politicians, and then they would do favors for me. And then he would say, that's a bad thing, and I'm going to fix that. So it's actually conceivable that he could end up on the reformist side of issues about money and politics. He has some tendency in that direction. This is another area of possible conflict with Republicans. And if he did that, he could have considerable support from Democrats. So on the one hand, it's not easy to expect him to be pushing things that would get in the way of the kind of things that helped him and helped his friends. But there are some signs of his having that disposition, and it's not completely impossible that this could be this could be an area for some constructive action in his administration.
On the other hand, if I can push you on that, he's also in that New York Times interview declared himself basically exempt from, as the president legally is, exempt from conflict of interest laws, but he basically does not appear to be doing anything to insulate himself and his political decision-making, including his family members, from the global business empire that he has. What are your, among other things, does not that set a disastrous model for the rest of the world, where we're trying to promote good governance on financial matters and end corruption?
Yeah, I think it's a stunningly inconsistent set of positions that he has taken, and he's taken them both very openly. So he's calling foreign leaders and saying, here's what I want to have happen in relations with the United States, and here's what I want to have happen with my golf course in your country.
Yeah.
All in the same.
So he doesn't need lobbyists because there's only one lobby left, the Trump organization.
And stay in my hotel and buy my daughter's jewelry. I think at state dinners we'll see people with the Ivanka Trump, the leaders' spouses and the Ivanka Trump jewelry.
Well, so we have to say that it is at this point there are no laws against what he's doing apparently, as far as I know. But I think the protest against that will be considerable, and he will not have support from the Republicans in Congress on that kind of conduct. So I think that he might get shot down somehow on his plans to conduct his business while being president.
So I think we have time for 3 more questions. The first one over here.
I'm Henry. I'm a first-year student here from the U.S. I have a question on healthcare. We haven't really gone into this at all. And Trump has been like a stout disadvocate of Obamacare, and everybody else in Congress and all the other branches have been as well.
Okay. So Republicans have been saying that they would abolish Obamacare and have been taking symbolic actions to do that every chance they can for several years. Obamacare has been repealed by the House of Representatives over 40 times. And on the other hand, they have not been at all clear how they would replace Obamacare, and there are aspects of Obamacare that are clearly popular and would be difficult to replace. One of them is the guarantee against being denied health care coverage because of pre-existing conditions. And then the other aspect is that there are now 20 or 30 million people in the country who have health coverage who would not have had it without Obamacare. I would say that the Republicans somewhat have a lion by the tail on the issue of Obamacare. That is, they've made really strong representations that they're going to get rid of it. They now have the power to get rid of it, but whether they can and what they would do about it is very unclear.
Okay. Sumit?
I just wanted to follow up on that, on the question about lobbying. He's also put one of his list, on his list of things to do in 100 days, is to get rid of term limits on introduce term limits on capital. And I'm not sure, I'm sure there'll be opposition, but do you have a sense of where?
That requires a constitutional amendment and is totally and completely impossible.
Okay, if I can, maybe I'll ask the panelists to a minute or less of concluding thoughts. And I actually, Dick, I wanted to start with you because I remember it would have been 15 years ago, we were in this room and you were giving a talk about 9/11. And I just remember you saying something like, you always remember like what you were doing and what you were thinking about where you were in your life on this day. And how would you compare the historic significance of Trump's election to 9/11?
I do think this is potentially that kind of event. 9/11 was unambiguously that kind of event. And it was the third kind of event of that in my sort of political lifetime. I would say the first was the fall of Berlin Wall, Eastern Europe, the revolutions, and the end of the Cold War. That was a clearly transformative moment. 9/11, a clearly transformative moment. This one, as I was mentioning to Paul before, in my view, isn't as bright line in and of itself, that kind of sharp break, but I think it gives massive momentum to important developments that I've characterized as the increasing illiberal forces in the world. So it's not as sharp a break, but I think it gives a tremendous push to those developments, which have preceded Trump and will keep going without Trump. But the sheer impact and weight of the United States simply can't be ignored.
And Paul, you have a long history under your belt with American politics. How big a thing do you think that is? You compared Trump's current power to Roosevelt's. That was quite a long time ago.
Yeah, I don't think there's been any election. Well, there's never been an election in the United States with implications so shocking for so many people as this one has been. I think because of the combination of the what's important is that the parties are extremely polarized. The Republican Party is more conservative, more extreme in its conservatism than either party has ever been with respect to its own ideology ever in the United States. We have good measurements of the ideological positions of the parties. So and then we've never had a president who had such obvious risks with respect to potential for pathological behavior and foreign policy crises and the like. And so there's many ways why this is a shocking and disturbing election to many people. I do think that there's a considerable possibility for there to be a relatively rapid backlash, and there could be a major reversal of fortunes as early as the 2018 midterm elections. And that could essentially cancel most of the policy change in that direction. There'd still be a lot that would have happened, that's going to affect people's confidence in American values, confidence in the United States, the authorization for kind of racist language and so forth, all that still has happened, but there might really be a rapid reversal of political power.
Kathy, concluding thoughts?
I think things may get pretty ugly on, with respect to energy and climate policy on both sides of the Canada-US border in the years to come. I think that the scale of protest, the nature of the protests is likely to change because there is growing desperation among those who are concerned about climate change. And we already weren't on track, anywhere close to on track for a 2C world, and the risk of stalling even what little momentum had been gained with the election of Donald Trump and a Republican Congress, I think, I fear, will push a lot of people over to different forms of protest.
And Werner, last word.
Last words. In some ways, the election has been quite transformative. When you look at how the election was conducted, the Clinton campaign was well organized. They outspent Trump by a fair margin, and still Trump got all the attention. And the press jumped on all his words, and he just needed to tweet something, and it was reported the next day, front page. So something really has happened in the way election campaigns unfold, and our perceived wisdom is no longer quite true about how they need to be conducted in the future. I think we need to learn from this. If liberal democracies want to counter the threat of illiberalism and populism, we need to smarten up to think about how we get the issues front and center and not get dominated by the next tweet from somebody like Donald Trump.
Okay, and with that, I wanted to thank the Lind Initiative for sponsoring the event and thank all of you for coming out today, and please join me in thanking the panel again.